Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. I'm Mikhail Tank. Today's guest is author and Dr. Alex Lickerman, whose book, The Undefeated Mind, is available at bookstores and Amazon, Kindle, and other retailers. Welcome, Dr. Lickerman.
Thanks for having me.
Please tell us about the conception of the book. I know that you had a bad breakup, which started this book. If you could just describe to the audience how it all came about.
Sure. It wasn't actually so much the breakup that started the book. That's just sort of how the book starts. The way the genesis of the book was actually after I had become a primary care physician and was working at the University of Chicago for a number of years, I gradually began to recognize that there's a certain degree of fragility or lack of resilience that a lot of patients struggled with when they would be confronted with their diseases. And in fact, there was one day, I remember very distinctly when I was in clinic, and I saw two patients in a row that really brought this point home to me. The first patient had a complaint really of just a runny nose. And what was really striking about his complaint was not so much the runny nose itself, but how devastated he seemed by this runny nose and how his life had really kind of ground to a halt as a result of the suffering he was experiencing because his nose would not stop dripping. And while I had, some sympathy suffering from allergies myself, I was just really struck by how out of proportion his distress was to the symptom. And then the next patient I saw was a woman who had been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer and was actually terminal. And she, on the other hand, was the picture of equipoise. She was unbelievably calm and had come somehow to a place of acceptance that was really startling to me. And I spent the entire time, frankly, just listening and learning from her and trying to understand how she could have achieved such a calm life state in the face of such a devastating diagnosis that I don't know that I myself will have when it comes my time to face my own imminent demise. And I left clinic that day thinking to myself, not just obviously how juxtaposed their reactions were to the individual problems that these two patients had, but just really struck by the fact that one, what's going on with us does not at all tell you about how we're internalizing what's going on with us, how much we're suffering as a result of what's going on. And also, I just got to wondering why people are different in their levels of resilience. And I had been what I call a secular Buddhist for decades, actually, practicing a form of Buddhism that holds as its primary tenet that happiness is possible only through strength, that the goal of practice is to develop your inner strength, and had a lot of philosophical notions around the great benefit of strength and how to achieve that strength. And I got very interested to know if there was research that actually supported these 2,500-year-old Buddhist philosophical ideas. And so that came together with my desire always to write a book. I'd always wanted to do that, and I thought I wanted to write a book that was supported by science, that offered people very practical tips about how to become more resilient themselves. And I wanted to sort of distill the best advice I kept giving over and over and over to my various patients and put it in one place that I could point people and say, here's my best thinking on the subject, and so go read it.
Wow. And I noticed that in the beginning of the book you mentioned how when you brought this manuscript to the agent, she was very excited and she sent it over, and how grateful you were to her. Can you describe that experience as a doctor, first-time author, and how valuable your manuscript really was, so that the agent just said, absolutely, I'll represent it?
Well, I mean, every author who's looking for an agent is a first-time author, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. Of course, the moment where an agent says, yes, I want to represent you, is thrilling beyond belief. And I'm no different from anybody else. I've always dreamed about being a writer, and I actually had always intended to write fiction and still actually do, but this project presented itself to me, and so I thought, all right, maybe this will be the first book I publish will be narrative nonfiction instead. So the actual genesis of this, believe it or not, was I started a blog in 2008, and an editor from an imprint of Penguin found my blog and contacted me out of the blue saying she loved it, and that if I ever wanted to write a book related to one of the subjects I was writing on the blog, she'd be delighted to hear from me. And so I Googled her and discovered that she was for real and got very excited. And it was actually to her that I pitched the idea of the Undefeated Mind. It was right around the time the idea was coming together. And so I wrote the book proposal, which in nonfiction, you don't actually write the entire book before you sell it. You write a proposal that you then send out to agents who then send it to publishers, and they buy the book based on the book proposal, and then you go write it. So I sent it to this editor without having an agent, and she loved it, but actually could not generate enough interest within her editorial board to actually accept it. So she very sadly had to decline it. And then I thought, well, I put way too much work into this at this point to give up on it. So I queried a bunch of agents, and actually the agent who ultimately I chose to work with, Stephanie Evans, who's fantastic, she replied to me that night and asked, based on my query letter, and asked if I was querying it to other agents. When I said I was, she said she'd get back to me quickly, and within 2 days she got back to me and said she loved it and wanted to represent it. And so I interviewed her and basically signed with her, and it's been great.
Congratulations. I think your book is destined to become a classic. I really do.
Well, I appreciate that.
When we look at the cover for The Undefeated Mind, a few things come to mind. First, we see a Buddhist figure, which I'd like to ask you about, how you chose this image, and why are the eyes closed? Is that peace, tranquility, strength? What is that?
Right. So it's a common misconception that authors who publish with publishing houses choose the cover.
Okay.
It was a collaborative effort. Actually, it was originally not my first choice at all, but that cover was chosen because these are all very pragmatic reasons. Publishers are in the business of selling books, and they want to create covers that generate the most interest. And so when they showed the cover around to a number of their foreign agents and the foreign publishing houses that they work with, that was the cover that got the strongest response. Mm-hmm. And so what it actually is a bust of the Buddha. Mm-hmm. There are many of those around, but it's sort of a famous bust that was just done with the eyes closed. The idea, though, I have to say, I actually like it a lot because I wanted it to portray the notion of tranquility and resilience, sort of calm tranquility. And obviously the book has a very Buddhist angle. It's really based in science, but it's organized around Buddhist principles. So the idea of lightly touching on the Buddhist element I thought was okay. Although, frankly, that was also a risk because Buddhism is not very mainstream, and I did not want to communicate to readers that this is only a book for people interested in Buddhism. It's really not intended that way. And so I hope it doesn't oversell that. But it was a nice way of melding the philosophy of Buddhism with the science.
Yes, spiritual medicine. I mean, the spiritual approach mixed with medicine is the best. Is the best, I think. That's what gives people a good bedside manner as doctors. That's what I found. And one of my favorite psychologists, David Burns, who's also on my show sometimes, deals with a spiritual approach to psychology as well. There's just something very humanistic about it, right?
Yeah, I like that word even better. I like the humanistic approach, right? That yes. It's not voodoo or mysticism, but it is concerned with compassion, suffering, the emotional experience of disease and health, and to consider that quality when you're a physician or any type of healer or someone in medicine or psychology as crucial, right? I mean, you can't really be an effective healer unless you have a relationship with the person you're healing. You care about how they're experiencing their illness.
A little deeper into that, do you ever feel that when you empathize too much, that sometimes you can take on some of the symptoms of the patient?
Oh, that's a great question. No, you don't. That's not the danger, actually. The danger of empathizing too much with the patient is not that you start to feel their same symptoms. The danger is it becomes emotionally exhausting. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of energy. There's an interesting phenomenon that I've observed in many middle-aged and elderly physicians, which is that after you've been taking care of people for a long enough time, it kind of flattens you out. You kind of become a little less emotionally responsive, mm-hmm. a little less empathetic, a little more guarded behind your professional demeanor. And I think a lot of that has to do with caring for people. If you're not good at balancing your own emotional reaction, it can be really exhausting. And, if I felt the same emotion that all of the patients I see all day long felt, at the end of the day, I wouldn't be able to function, to take that on. So you learn to become empathetic and to care, but not so much that you become exhausted and incapacitated.
Is that why? Is that why it's known that doctors shouldn't doctor their own families, because of that exact reason?
No, there's a different reason for that. When you're doctoring your own family, you're not thinking clearly. Mm-hmm. We all have, our minds are full of biases, and nothing affects our ability to think more clearly, or more significantly, I should say, than emotional bias. And so if you're taking care of someone who you love, you're not necessarily going to think rationally and clearly and make the best decisions for them. The other thing that's interesting is when you're taking care of someone you love, you will often not even think of things you should have, because to even admit them as a possibility is so frightening. Your mind recoils from that, and so you often limit your thinking and typically just don't do a good job.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
It's much better to separate those relationships, I think.
Mm-hmm. So no conflict of interest in a way, psychologically, right?
Yeah, exactly.
When we look at the cover again, let's go back to some of the words used, very powerful words. Undefeated, indestructible. These words are, in a way, extreme words, which caught my attention for sure. I really liked those words. I can imagine that some people could see those words as, what if somebody was to ask you, undefeated mind, what if somebody could see that as an egotistical term? How would you respond to that?
Well, I love that you love those words. That's exactly how they were designed to be experienced. Again, to be practical, from one perspective, a publisher's job is to use images and words in a title that pique people's interests and are dramatic. And a lot of times I've seen readers sometimes criticize both of those things, saying, well, this is an overpromise or this is egotistical. But really the whole point of titles is not just to communicate what the book is about, but actually to be dramatic in some way. To the idea that the title is egotistical, I would take issue with that. I think the idea is, I wanted to capture in that phrase, the undefeated mind, that we each have within us the ability to go on. We have within us the ability not to be defeated by obstacles and by our environment or by ourselves. And I think of it really as a hopeful, an enticement that you have this within you, and it doesn't make you special or arrogant. It's not arrogant to imagine you could be indestructible, but more, I think of it as a goal that we should all have, to have and develop an indestructible, undefeated mind.
Beautiful. Now, at the end, though, when death comes to each of us, does it in a way defeat us, or do we give way to it? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a really great question that has probably a very long discussion that we could have behind it. You could certainly imagine that to die is to be defeated. If the goal is to live and live forever, then death is defeat. And you could also argue that, well, since we'd all rather live forever, but we can't do anything about it, to accept death, in a sense, is also defeat. We can pretty it up and say, no, we accept it, so it's okay. I don't think about it that way. I think the notion of living forever is almost as frightening as the notion of dying. And so I think that if your goal is to be happy and to create as much value for yourself and for others as you can while you are alive, the goal is not to live forever, and that death is not actually defeat, but simply like the end. You know, you wouldn't not watch a movie just because it ends, right? And the movies end. And in fact, often how the movie ends affects your entire experience and memory of the movie. And so how we die and how we conclude our lives, in a sense, I think about as I'm hoping to be able to put wonderful finishing touches on my life and leave my life as a testament to how to live a life well, to how to be happy, to how to have great relationships and create as much value for others as I possibly could have. So I don't see death as defeat. I think you can be defeated by death if fear of death and the suffering you experience at the hands of death or knowing you're going to die dramatically impact and ruin your happiness. That to me is defeat from death.
Beautiful. Now, in the beginning of the book, you describe how you have this breakup where, and I want to go a little bit into that. As an adult male, one thinks, when people think of breakups, they think of high school, they think of, the teenage years, but breakups can affect people deeply at all ages. What is it about the fact that this lady rejected you, that took away your strength?
Yeah, great question. Well, I should first tell you, it was actually the very first real romantic relationship I had ever had, and even though I was older than most people when they have those relationships, I think that had a lot to do with its effect on me. But I think that, as I wrote about in the book, it really was about me. The reaction that I had and how devastated I was at losing this relationship was because I was deluded in thinking that I needed this relationship and I needed this woman to love me to be happy. That really was the belief. That was the connection. So when we broke up and she left, I did not know how to reconcile that notion with the fact that I could ever be happy again. I really didn't believe I could be. And so the suffering I experienced, in retrospect, I recognize it was because I felt like I was never going to be happy again. And my suffering over that breakup ended really when I realized that was not true. I deeply realized it, that it was not true, that I did not need her to love me to be happy. I just needed to love myself. Mm-hmm. So I think to some degree or another, we all kind of go through that lesson about learning to love ourselves without having to have someone else love us.
But what do you think it is that makes us give away ourselves, our strength, to someone else to that degree that we become unable to function because it's almost like believing in a false idol or something?
Yeah, well, that's what it is. I mean, so interestingly enough, this is what my next book is about. What is it we believe will make us happy? And it is the misconceptions we have about that determine most of our behavior and the mistakes we make. And I think it's very common to make the mistake that our happiness depends on being in a loving relationship with somebody else and having that person love us. And I think it really comes down to we're willing to give up a lot if we believe getting that is going to make us happy. And this doesn't tend to be the same type of suffering and mistake you see in people who are older, as you pointed out, just because when they're younger, they go through experiences like this, and many of them wake up to this fact. They realize, I really don't need to have someone to love me to be happy. I maybe really want it, but it's not what my happiness depends on. Then again, there are people who never learn that lesson and continue to search for love and feel unfulfilled without feeling it, and that they can't be happy unless they feel it. And unfortunately, I would argue, while love is a wonderful experience and adds to the richness of the experience of life, it is not in and of itself, romantic love, necessary for a happy life. And that's a lesson that some of us learn early, some of us learn late, and some of us never learn.
Great. And now let's discuss the Buddhism factor. This particular angle of Buddhism is kind of rare. You mentioned it's not the meditation. It's a different kind of Buddhism. Can you share with the audience what it's called, and how people can learn about it, and what its main goal is?
Yeah. So it's Nichiren Buddhism, after its founder, Nichiren Daishonin, and how it's different from many other forms of Buddhism is that rather than meditation, the practice is chanting a mantra, which is Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So I will confess that I'm really not a believer in the mystical aspects of this religion, and it really is a religion. But the philosophy and the practice I have found to be tremendously benefiting to my life. And the central tenet of Buddhism is that indestructible happiness, absolute happiness that cannot be torn down by anything that happens to you, is possible if you cultivate inner strength. And that the way you cultivate inner strength is by acquiring wisdom. It is wisdom that makes you strong. But the only way you can acquire wisdom is by having challenges in life and suffering through experiences that you triumph over and learn from. It gradually forges you into this really strong, supremely joyful and happy and wise person. So I have found a lot of the philosophy of Buddhism, the principles which I sort of organized the book around, to be practically very helpful in how I think about and approach my own life. And then the practice of Buddhism, the chanting, I found has a very particular effect that I found very useful.
What exactly is it about the chanting? Does it bring you into your unconscious self?
That's a fantastic question. In fact, that's exactly what I think it does. So the Buddhists will argue that the reason chanting works is because you're invoking the name of the mystic law, that the mystic law itself is Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. By chanting it, you are channeling some type of mystic power. I can't say I actually believe that. I've seen no evidence that that's true, and I am, at my core, a scientist. I need evidence to believe anything. I'll believe anything, no matter how wacky it is, if there's evidence to support it, but I haven't seen that. I have an experience of this that when you chant, it's sort of like, it's going to sound a little mundane, it's sort of like swinging a baseball bat or, taking a shower or taking a walk. It seems, and this is just my theory, I don't know that this is true, but it seems to me that it actually distracts the conscious executive part of our minds that are very rigid in its thinking, logical in its thinking, that when we do brain scans and see people who are actually, engaging with their conscious, logical minds, the other part of the brain that's responsible for more creative endeavors and creative thinking shuts down. It's as if you can't easily engage those two parts of your brain at the same time. And my own personal experience is that when I chant, the logical part of my mind kind of goes to sleep a little bit. And I think, get more access to the creative parts of my mind. So, for example, I've chanted about challenges I've had in my writing, and when I've gotten blocked in writing and I don't know how to move forward, and people who don't chant have this experience all the time. You get away from it, and then suddenly, you're in the shower or you're taking a walk, and bang, the way forward, shows itself. You have this new creative insight, this new idea, and then suddenly you're off to the races again. And there's something about removing or minimizing the activity of the logical mind that makes those insights more possible. And what I found is, and I really don't understand why this happens, but again and again I've observed it, when I chant about problems in my life that I don't know how to solve or that I've been trying to solve with my logical mind and sort of push my logical mind out of the picture, creative solutions that hadn't been clear to me will start popping up. And what's interesting to me is that these solutions have anything to do with the problem I'm chanting about at all, but invariably they do, as if the deeper, wiser part of me is sending me a message. And often these solutions are either solutions I haven't thought about or the solutions I have thought about but I've rejected because maybe they're too frightening to enact or I'm worried that they're going to cost too much. Often when we have problems in life, the solutions are there. We're just not willing to pick them up. And what changes in those moments for me is not necessarily that the idea is so brand new, but the way I look at it is very different. And suddenly it becomes a possibility where a moment before it was not a possibility I was willing to entertain. So that's my long-winded way of answering your question, that I do actually think chanting gives us access to the creative and wise part of our unconscious minds.
Now, you mentioned that you begin to listen and trust that deeper, wiser part of yourself. What would you call that part?
I would call that part, boy, I don't have a good name for it. I think our wisest self. Well, I'll tell you what I would call that part. I would call that part our Buddha nature. The part of our wisest, most joyful, most compassionate, most energetic and powerful selves. It is the aspect of ourselves that we really want to manifest at all times, our Buddha nature, as opposed to, say, our depressed nature or our angry nature. It's us the entire time, but it is different aspects of us that we try to manifest.
So if we were all to connect in the Buddha nature, wouldn't that in effect provide a certain kind of core, this is what all the beauty queens say on Miss USA and stuff, but wouldn't it provide a certain kind of true peace to humanity?
Well, I almost wonder if you're pitching me softballs on purpose or not, because the organization of lay Buddhists has as its mission world peace, but the way it aims to achieve world peace is by helping individual people become absolutely happy, meaning to manifest their Buddha natures where they are supremely wise. So rather than pretend that we don't have problems in this world, if you had everybody was able to cast off their delusionary thinking and their negativity and really work together wisely for the betterment of all mankind, that's how you achieve world peace, by the individual human revolution, or revolution of individual natures, so that people are expressing their highest, best selves at all times. That's how you do it.
Yes. And then what would people do with their cultural wounds, the wounds they carry along through generations that they can't seem to get rid of on their own?
Well, If you are flourishing and have manifested enlightenment in a Buddha nature, those wounds would take care of themselves, I think. You would begin to see them in a very different light, and the need you have for those to be healed by others would disappear. You would find a way to heal yourself.
Beautiful.
Heal them in yourself.
Well said, well said. Next question is about acceptance.
Yes.
You mentioned before the concept of acceptance. Now, in modern day thinking, acceptance can definitely be seen as passive. So, what's the difference between positive acceptance and self-defeating acceptance?
Yeah. It depends on what it is you are accepting and how that acceptance is functioning in your life, whether to create value or to destroy it. So when I talk about acceptance in the book, I'm not actually talking about accepting what happens to you necessarily, accepting that bad things happen, although there is a part of the book where I talk about that, and I can discuss that in a minute. Where the real power of acceptance comes from is accepting what you are feeling. The term I use for this is emotional constipation. We are an incredibly emotionally constipated society, and by that I mean we are taught from almost day one, and while I think this is especially true for males, it's also true for females, not to feel what we're feeling. Meaning, you fall on the playground and skin your knees, start crying, and people rush up to you. No, it's okay. Don't cry. You're okay. Or when we have a feeling and we're upset about something, we're told, well, no, don't be upset. That's not a problem that you think it is. It's this, not that. We get all these messages that it's not okay for us either to feel what we feel, or certainly not okay to express what we feel. And so we grow up learning to suppress those feelings. And there's a lot of studies that show that is really not healthy. What ends up happening is then that we will avoid trying to accomplish things we care about. We will avoid trying to accomplish our dreams when we contemplate what we have to do in order to accomplish those dreams, and negative emotions begin coming up. The tasks we would have to carry out to accomplish these goals bring with them tremendous negative emotions, fear, anger, shame, guilt, that we don't want to feel. Anxiety, that's a big one. And so we solve the problem very easily. We solve the problem of feeling anxiety. We get ourselves to stop it by deciding we're not going to actually go after this dream that would cause us anxiety. And so we win in the sense that we can prevent ourselves from feeling badly, but we lose because we prevent ourselves from accomplishing our dreams. So the chapter that I think you might be referring to is called Accept Pain, and the notion is this. We have this idea in our society, we should never feel badly. That anytime we have a bad feeling, we need to run away from it, or we need to medicate it, we need to do something about it. But in fact, feeling badly is a natural part of being a human being. And we find that when people try to suppress those negative feelings, like anxiety, invariably all that does is make it worse. And so there are numerous studies now that are pushing forth this new idea of something called acceptance therapy. It's actually called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, A-C-T. And it's actually based on a Buddhist principle, the notion of acceptance, not of terrible things happening to you, not of your fate and just accept it and don't fight it, but of negative feelings that prevent you from striving to actually solve your problems. So the example I like to give is if you think about a young person, of college age who may be attracted to somebody they want to ask out, that is often a very anxiety-inducing prospect. And a lot of people will struggle with that and ultimately, not ask out a person they may be interested in dating because it prevents them feeling anxiety. Well, what we would suggest you do instead is look at that anxiety and accept it, and allow yourself to feel it. You don't try to resist it, you let it in. And in letting it in, what the studies show is paradoxically it diminishes its impact and its intensity. Now, it turns out that's not the goal of acceptance. The goal of acceptance is not to reduce the anxiety you're feeling, it's to increase your capacity to feel it. So I'll give you a really great example, a practical example of how this can be made to work for you. I had a friend who not long ago said to me he was really struggling because his doctor had said he needed an MRI of his some body part, I don't know what it was, to diagnose something. But I don't know if you've ever had an MRI, but it's like being wheeled into a coffin. It's incredibly
Claustrophobic.
incredibly small space. People who are claustrophobic really struggle. We often give sedatives before people go into those machines to help calm them down, and that usually works. But it didn't work for him. He tried 4 times, and each time had to interrupt the exam. He couldn't complete it because he was so panicked. And he didn't know what he was going to do because he needed the exam. And I said, I think you're looking at this wrong. Instead of getting in there and worrying about the anxiety, imagine your anxiety as a separate person from you. A little gremlin living in your body a little fire that gets lit as soon as you get wheeled in that machine. And I want you to look at that separate feeling, that person, and say to it, bring it on. You think you're going to make me run on this machine? Bring it on. What do you got? The idea being, when you feel anxiety and you're trying to resist it, what you're actually saying to yourself is you are too weak to withstand it. You have to escape it. And of course, since you can't escape it by suppressing it, the fact that you can't escape it only makes the anxiety worse. You actually get anxious about the fact that you can't stop yourself from feeling anxiety. And then what happens is you figure out how to stop it, and that is to run away from the trigger. And in his case, that was get out of the MRI machine. But instead, when you look at that anxiety and you say, bring it on, you're saying to yourself, I can handle this. I'm strong enough to withstand it. And you stop directing your energy to running, and you redirect your energy to withstanding it. And he told me the next week, he said to me, you're not going to believe this, but I got in there and I tried that, and I didn't even feel the anxiety at all. And he completed the exam, and he was able to do what he needed to do. And it illustrates how many different aspects of our lives we stop ourselves, or we tell ourselves we can't do something, not because there's an external obstacle stopping us, but because there's an internal obstacle. It is the negative, unpleasant feelings that arise when we start to take action towards that goal that we decide we can't handle, that stop us. And if you start looking at those feelings instead of with acceptance, saying, I am strong enough to handle this, it doesn't make it easy. It feels really bad to feel anxiety, but it doesn't stop you from getting done what you need to do. And I contend, in fact, as I've gone around the country and giving a talk about this and challenged people with this notion, that if you really pick this up and practice it, like an Olympic athlete training for your event, you actually get better at it, and you will become unleashed. You will be capable of doing things and accomplishing goals and dreams you never imagined you could. It just takes practice.
That's very beautifully said. As a 12, 13-year-old, I was breaking down, and this concept came to me called Dark Soul, from which I made a theater and all this stuff. And it was all about turning the darkness, living through it, feeling it, and creating art through it, art therapy naturally. It was turning dark into light. Now, sometimes people, when they try to face a problem and they can't seem to find a solution, they break apart and become destructible and become defeated. So what happens when all of us reach our breaking point? So let's say people stand in the and they stand and they face anxiety and they say, bring it on. What happens when that anxiety, it reaches your breaking point? What do you do then?
Yeah. Let's say 2 things. One is the type of anxiety I'm talking about here is not what I would term pathological anxiety, meaning anxiety related to a mental disorder. Mm-hmm. So people who have panic attacks or generalized anxiety disorder, while this technique can be helpful, it's probably not going to be enough. Mm-hmm. People who really have an illness that way need professional help, and whether that's therapy or medication, mm-hmm. because their brain wiring is haywire in such a way that they're not able to quiet abnormal amounts of anxiety. That really needs medical attention. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, if you don't have that problem and you're just really anxious or sad or guilty or angry or some feeling that's just really making you suffer, mm-hmm. If your question is, what do you do when you hit your breaking point? My answer is, at some level, at what point you say, this is my breaking point, is a decision you make. Mm-hmm. It's not something that's done to you. You decide, mm-hmm. this is my breaking point. And I illustrate that actually in one of the early chapters called Find Your Mission, where studies really show when you are armed with a sense of purpose, mm-hmm. that you find supremely important, mm-hmm. you will discover your breaking point is nowhere near what you thought it was. Mm-hmm. If you're a parent and your child's life is in danger, you will find yourself capable of withstanding pain you did not imagine you could when you're motivated enough. So there is some degree, I think, to some degree, a fiction that we have a breaking point. We assign ourselves that breaking point, and we're often much more capable of enduring pain than we think we are, beyond the point we say we can't.
So then, if breaking points are kind of an illusion, why do we create them?
Well, because pain is aversive. We don't like feeling it, and we'd rather not feel it. And depending on the reason we are feeling it, how we interpret that pain can affect our breaking point. So, for example, pain that we believe represents physical damage to our body is much more aversive, causes much more suffering than pain, say, of equal intensity from exercise. So how we interpret the pain really matters, how we endure it and whether or not we can endure it. But however you slice it, pain is unpleasant. We evolved to avoid it. So it's not at all difficult to imagine why we would say to ourselves, nope, I can't stand this pain anymore, I'm leaving, I'm stopping. Or I want to get away from it. I want to devote all my energies to getting away from it. It really depends on what the pain is caused by and whether it's something that indicates damage and injury that we need to take care of, or it is out of proportion to what's going on and we need to withstand it in order to accomplish a goal.
And then tell me, is there an option of going too far with it onto becoming a masochist? Is there a way to stop it before it gets to that point?
Well, I think that's a point of individual judgment. I guess, you might be willing to withstand a lot of pain in service of an important goal. And you certainly could. I think there is the possibility of sort of overdoing it. And if you endure so much pain that you become damaged, if there's a process that is damaging you, then you have to use your best judgment. But the type of pain we're talking about, the emotional pain, the psychological pain, if it is in the service of an important goal, is usually, number one, not permanent. It's temporary. Will not do any lasting damage. As unpleasant as anxiety is, by itself, it can't hurt you. There is some evidence that chronic anxiety that elevates cortisol levels can, in fact, over time, do a lot of damage to your body. And so I certainly wouldn't recommend living with anxiety, for years and years and years. But usually we're not talking about that. We're talking about goal achievement. So yeah, I think you always want to be careful and take care of yourself and know what, if any, risk you might really be putting yourself at. But in the short run and temporarily, if you need to withstand a great amount of pain to accomplish an important goal, that's not usually, we wouldn't call those people masochists, we'd call them determined.
Okay. And before we go a little bit deeper into your book specifically, a couple of more human questions like this. Do you think masochism is indeed a disorder?
I haven't given a lot of thought to that. I think people who find pleasure in pain itself, that's, as long as that's usually in a particular context, say a sexual context, sadomasochism, right? They find pain sexually stimulating. Whether that's a disorder that needs to be treated, I don't know. I think as long as people are careful and don't actually physically harm themselves, if they find pain sexually stimulating or otherwise, as long as they're not doing real damage, I don't know that if a patient came to me and asked me that I need to treat them, I don't know that I would feel I needed to.
I see.
But I think people who intentionally sabotage themselves or punish themselves because they're angry at themselves or they're trying to be self-destructive, that's very unhealthy.
Now, and what if there's someone else in a person's life, an abuser of some sort, who breaks you down in any sense? How does this relate to that? Do you stay undefeated by becoming stronger than that person in a way, just psychologically, or is the undefeated by leaving? What is that? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that really is going to vary from circumstance to circumstance. I don't know that I could give a formula for how you deal with that, except to say that I don't think it's ever okay for anyone to abuse anyone else, no matter how they may be doing it. And so how you solve that problem depends on what the source of the problem is. So somebody might be being abusive to you because they themselves are in pain that they're not acknowledging, and they're projecting their anger onto you, and that might be a problem that's solvable. Other people might be abusive to you because they were abused themselves and are so full of anger and are so mentally imbalanced that they're not going to be fixed. The problem, of course, is that people don't come with labels saying I'm fixable or I'm not fixable. You have to sort of figure that out and make a judgment, and you won't necessarily ever know for sure that you're right. So everybody has to make that judgment for themselves, but I think it begins from the place of saying it is never all right for anyone to abuse you in any way. Now, it gets even more complex because what you what you interpret as abuse may not actually be actually abuse. Some people are overly sensitive to this and think that they're being abused when they're not. And so it's very nuanced and very difficult to sort out. Like I said, I don't know how I have a formula for that.
Now, in terms of re-strengthening oneself, how important is a sacred space, quality sleep? What are the tools for really maintaining an undestructible mind?
Yeah, well, so that's a great point because, if you don't take care of some of your basic physiological needs, it's impossible to be undefeated. Sleep is crucial. I spend a lot of my time counseling people about their lack of sleep. We are a chronically sleep-deprived society. People think they can get away with lack of sleep because the effects at first are very subtle. And I can't tell you how many patients have come in to me complaining of real physical and emotional problems that really just boil down to an inadequate amount of sleep. Studies show most people need around 8 hours a night, and most people don't get 8 hours a night. There are a fortunate few who can get away with 7, and an unfortunate few who need 9. But it's an extraordinarily rare set of people who can get away with less than 7, and most of us can't. So, sleep deprivation leading to chronic fatigue can dramatically reduce your ability to manage frustration, to concentrate, to remember, to think logically and clearly, and to emotionally regulate yourself. So those are all really important things to be able to do to maintain an indestructible mind, an undefeated mind. So without sleep, you're in trouble. Same thing with nutrition. We're learning more and more about how, a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie, that the different types of foods we eat affect not only our weight, but also diseases we may be at risk for, and even our moods. So I think those things are extremely important. Good exercise as well, avoiding bad habits, drinking too much alcohol, abusing substances. You want to optimize the functioning of the machine that is your brain and body to be able to be undefeated. And if you don't care for it the way you would your car, to expect it to function optimally is silly.
What if we bring it down to a kind of a harsh reality? People on the street, let's say there's a homeless population, and let's say they need to stay very, very strong and undefeated and indestructible. How can they do that with their limited abilities?
Yeah, that's really a hard question to answer. I don't know if I have a good answer for that because, of course, not all challenges are created equal, and not all people have equal resources to meet those challenges, right? Mm-hmm. Having money and a house, roof over your head, and the ability to eat really matters. Mm-hmm. So if you're homeless, your challenge lies not at sort of the level of am I going to achieve my dream or not, but am I going to be able to eat today or not? Mm-hmm. So, how do we as a society help people like that? I mean, the problem, of course, is also that the reasons those people are homeless vary. Some people are homeless because they're drug abusers. Some people are homeless because they're mentally ill. Mm-hmm. Some people are homeless because they've lost their job and they don't have anyone to support them. They don't have a social net, safety net. And then how would you introduce them to ideas like this and train them and teach them to actually do it? I mean, frankly, I struggle with that. Even just with people who have homes, how do you train people in school to become resilient? Because we haven't talked much about this at all. But after I wrote this book, when I was at the University of Chicago, I created a course, a curriculum that translated the ideas into exercises that I taught to students to actually enhance their resilience. So we studied it and found it actually worked. And I thought to myself, no one in our society, nowhere do we learn this. Are we taught how to be resilient? Are we taught techniques concretely that we can use to enhance our own individual resilience? So it's a struggle even just in school and in my patient population to train this. With homeless people, I really don't know. I do believe if you can introduce them to these ideas and help them practice them, that would be beneficial to them. But of course, it all depends on why they're homeless to begin with and what their deficit is, what resources they don't have that they need to actually be resilient. And so it's like Maslow's hierarchy. If they're mentally ill and they're psychotic and you're not treating that psychosis, it doesn't matter how much you teach them to be resilient, you're not going to get very far with them. You have to really meet them where they are and help them with the problems that they have that got them there in the first place.
Now, we all have an Achilles heel, kind of a place of our deepest weakness. What do we do when let's say we train ourselves, we deal with adversity, we accept challenges, we pull through, we talk to the gremlin of anxiety and we tell him to step aside. But each of us has kind of a weak spot. People nearby, let's say perhaps enemies or people who don't wish us well, if any of us have them, the more successful people are, the more they may encounter this kind of stuff. And they know how to press that button. They know what those weaknesses are. How do we strengthen particularly our most vulnerable spaces?
Well, I think the first answer is you have to identify it. You can't solve a problem until you know what it is. And then you need to figure out what is known about solving that particular problem. A lot of people often try to make this stuff up and try to reinvent the wheel. But in fact, sometimes there are known, tested solutions to those weaknesses. So for example, let's say your weakness is you have a real temper and you can't control your temper. So the question is why? And if it's disruptive enough that it's disrupting your relationships and you can't seem to control it, that would be the kind of thing you want to go to a professional for and actually get help with. If your weakness, on the other hand, is you have poor self-esteem and you don't believe in yourself and you don't feel you have value, that's a real hard problem to solve. You have to prove to yourself you do, and so you have to take those steps. And maybe what the steps is to actually get training in an area where you feel you're not very good and don't believe you have value so that you actually have value. So really the answer, I think, unfortunately depends on the specific weakness you're talking about and how it manifests itself and how much it costs you to endure that weakness rather than to solve it.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So we're speaking with Dr. Alex Lickerman of the book The Undefeated Mind, which you can find on Amazon, your local bookstores. Do you have any signed copies available through your website?
No, I'm afraid I don't, but it is available both as a paperback and Kindle for e-readers on Amazon.
When is your next book coming out?
Well, if I make my deadline, it's coming out the first quarter of next year, 2018.
Wonderful. There's 10 chapters in this book. They deal with accepting pain, letting go, making a vow, lots of very strengthening tools. Basically, this book is meant to strengthen us as individuals. What do you think society has... Why have we become weak?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I have theories. It's also very hard. Every generation thinks the generation that comes after it is weaker, less resilient, less virtuous than their current generation. So there's always a bit of perspective you need to have with that judgment, and it's not entirely sure. Having said that, the last 5 years of my career before I started my own private practice was as the Assistant Vice President for Student Health and Counseling Services at the University of Chicago. So I actually had a pretty clear view of students for about 5 years and the level of resilience, fragility they had. And they really do seem to be far less resilient than they used to be. So the easy answer is that it's the parenting style of the last 10 or 20 years, that parents have been too permissive, have not allowed their children to discover their own strength by failing and to learn that they can help themselves back up, but have rushed in to prevent them from feeling any unpleasant feeling, including failure. And so that students and young people today have not had the experience of themselves as resilient and don't believe they are resilient. And that may be a large part of it, but the incidence of depression and anxiety are rising, and that could again be because of local societal factors. But for all I know, the toxins we've been pouring into the environment from industry could play a role in this as well. I think it's really an open question as to why this generation seems far less resilient than past generations. So I don't know.
Then if I was to ask you, Buddhism, aside from being a religion, what is it for you? Is it a way of re-strengthening yourself? Is it a tool of mind?
It is a set of principles that I find powerful to leverage in my own life, a way of thinking about myself and the world and my relationships that I find wise. And it is a practice that has a very specific effect on helping me to solve problems that I don't always know how to solve through a logical manner that I require creative insight to solve. and a way of really expanding my own life and life condition to become a wiser, happier person. Wow. By awakening to truths that I think are lying in my own life that when I meet challenges, I have a chance to discover and learn.
What is the core principle there which makes it work? Is it self-resistance? What are the working mechanisms behind it?
Behind the chanting, you mean?
Yes.
I don't know. As I said earlier, I have a theory that it has to do with a shutting down of the logical part of the brain and an opening up of the more creative part of the brain. I can only tell you this: I don't believe it's through a mystical law. I think it's through a very real psychological or neurologic mechanism that enhances creative problem solving. I think that's really what it's about.
Wonderful. So in a way, creativity and the unconscious can heal a lot of things and re-strengthen.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. Absolutely.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I tell you, you've been particularly skillful at asking fantastic questions, so I think you pulled out of me everything that I would think to say. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, well, Dr. Lickerman, it's been a true pleasure to have you on the show. As I tell the audience and anyone who will hear this interview in the future, The Undefeated Mind on the Science of Constructing an Indestructible Self. I hope and wish and I believe that this recent book will become a classic because it deserves to be a classic. So pick up a copy and become stronger. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being on the show.